Greetings everyone, Dumelang, Sanbonani. Welcome to the first official episode of the Politics of You and Me. The truth is, politics is ingrained in every aspect of our lives, from the digital divide to gender inequality, from environmental injustice to the education crisis. Every issue shapes the way we work, we live, and choose to exist. Now, this podcast unpacks the lived realities of South Africans, amplifying voices left unheard. It is a hub to engage and challenge while learning about current affairs in South Africa and beyond. Guided by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as per Agenda 2030, it is a platform to generate impact through dialogue. And with that, it is such an honor to be able to bring this platform and this lifelong dream to reality, to make it manifest, as I've been sitting on it for the last couple of months. But before we dig into today's topic, our first episode, just a bit of a background. My name is Mpho Nyamathe. I am a politics and international relations scholar. My second major is also sociology. I completed my degree at the University of Johannesburg, and I've always been a volunteer at heart. I started at Monash Saturday School, teaching young children the subjects of math and English over the weekend. And it really showed me the importance of inclusive development, especially in an era of rapid change. Some of my accolades include attending the Green Summit in 2022 as a Green Ambassador for the Humanitarian Affairs in Asia. This was at the United Nations Asia Pacific headquarters, and with more than 150 country delegates, I really was compelled to localize a lot of the global issues and put them into our country's context. For example, climate change. So another one of my accolades is that I was able to facilitate a policy talk on the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2250 of 2015, which basically translates to SDG 17. This is the partnership and inclusivity of young people in policy building and, the creation of peace. So with that, I really hope that this can be a platform for young people to engage, to challenge, to learn, and to really see how politics is ingrained in every single aspect of our lives. Some of the historical factors and the social factors of our country and beyond affect how we work, live, and exist. So with that, I want to kick us right into today's topic: digital inclusion in an era of rapid change. Now, with this, I want us to specifically focus on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. When we look at the Fourth Industrial Revolution, it has often been coined as a combination of technologies such as robotics, Internet of Things, 3D printing, nanotechnology, and autonomous vehicles. And with that, there's an argument that it offers limitless opportunities for connectivity. I mean, how easy is it for us to reach some of our favorite creators and our loved ones who are continents away, but we can easily reach them with a click of a button. This Fourth Industrial Revolution has also been coined as rapid technological advancement in the 21st century. However, there's also been a notion of presenting 4IR as unproblematic, and I want us to interrogate that in accordance to historical factors in our country, as well as social factors. So with that, I'm going to be digging into the fourth industrial revolution and breaking it down as per each industrial revolution. Starting with the first. The first industrial revolution was specifically centered on transportation, the creation and emergence of coal and steam engines. Now, this allowed for railway lines, and this also was used to transport goods, but also for human beings, specifically human beings in rural areas, to make their way up to the city. And when we're looking at South Africa's context, especially back then, the technologies really drove the mining sector, right? It also encouraged the transportation of Black migrant workers from rural areas into the city where most of the work was being done. And the problem with that is we can already trace the inequality there, because at the same time there was spatial divides, especially in our country, that still hold till today, where people in townships often have to travel a very short distance to get into the city. And when we look at the context of our transportation, more than 65%, could be more, of South Africans rely on minibus taxis. And the problem with that is they've been incredibly unsafe for women, queer individuals, and especially at times where it's dark and there's no access as well to electricity at that time. And with that, I'd also want to dig into the importance of His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address this year, which really highlighted that there is a lot to be reconciled as part of apartheid town planning. Now, when we look at the second industrial revolution, this looked more on electricity generation, was focused on electricity generation. When we look at electricity in itself, it really improves the living conditions of individuals, human beings, but specifically women. It promotes the use of appliances, but it also encourages safety, because when areas are brightly lit, there are less safety concerns. And I'm sure the women listening to this know just how terrifying it can be to be in an instance where you have to get home alone, but at the same time, it's very dark in the area that you're walking in. It's a safety concern. Now, when we take it back to women in rural areas, a lot of the time they often also have to walk long distances to fetch wood, and use that as an energy source. But if we trace our painful past, our history, electricity around the years of 1892 was really supplied to white residents. And even the Electricity Supply Commission, it really developed electrification for the benefit of industries instead of people, right? Now, the problem with that is that electricity really thrived on the exploitation of cheap Black labor as well, meaning that Black people back in those times were not even allowed to vote. As such, they did not have the platform to speak on the working conditions there. Now, the kind of contemporary issues that we have right now is a lot of people now struggle to afford electricity, because in a sense, the way it was supplied in the past, the way it was generated in the past, was truly unequal. And now when we move to the third industrial revolution, This is basically made possible by electronics, microchips, data, and cell phone communications. In our country, cell phone networks, they started operating around 1994, and this paved the way for massive privatized communication, right? But on the subject of the third industrial revolution, I want to pose a question that you can all sit with as you listen to this. How many of you can actually afford data? Because the data prices in our country are extremely high, especially for people who are unemployed, especially for people who earn low wages, and we can't even begin to talk about people who live in rural areas and do not really have the bandwidth to even be effectively using these types of technologies. Now, we've broken down the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, the third, and now we're moving on to the fourth. And this was really guided by a really wonderful critique that was authored by, or rather edited by, Dr. Trevor Ngwane, one of my former lecturers in sociology, and Mahleko Tsoedi as well. And this is basically a sociological critique, and a lot of what I've said in terms of breaking that down was informed by this book that really, really paints the picture of where we come from as a country, where we're at, and where we still have to go, right? So when we look at the conversation of the fourth industrial revolution, it's important to acknowledge some of its critiques, right? Especially within the context of this book, it speaks about how it doesn't necessarily address the transformation required to end poverty, inequality, racism. And the solutions that are presented are mostly aligned with advancing capitalism and increasing profits, right? Now, when we're looking right back at all of our progress that we've made, if we look at the first industrial revolution, which was based on transport, our country's transport infrastructure still needs to be developed at a massive scale. I always say that sometimes I really wish we had a widespread train network that works across our country, not just in specific areas, and not just as well in areas that are only affluent, right? As well as safety concerns in transport situations that would be accessible to the average South African. And then we were talking about electricity generation. Load shedding is still a problem in our country. In township spaces, it's not even load shedding, it's load reduction. Electricity is taken at extended amounts of times. So then what do we say to the young people who are studying for the exams and trying to make it out of high school into university? And that's where a lot of our gaps are. When we look at the third industrial revolution, how many people can use their phones? How many people can also use the data to get access to opportunities that would enrich their livelihoods, to economic opportunities that would really give them a life above the poverty line? Because at the rate in which we are going, it seems that the more we experience rapid industrialization, is the more we leave more people behind. Hence why in the South African artificial intelligence framework, they really talk about the importance of fitting AI into South Africa's needs as a society. And I think that's the most viable solution, right? And there's still much of a conversation to be had, but just a couple of things to reflect on, right? So, when we're also looking at some of the inequalities, historical inequalities, and how they inform our contemporary situation, it is really important to note that racial, gender, and income differences, they all play a part in unequal access to digital technology. And this leaves women, specifically those living in poverty, with fewer opportunities. I mean, when we look at apartheid, Black women in traditional African societies were subordinate to men, and that also limited how they participated in the economy. The problem is generational poverty, generational exclusion, all of those things, they exist and they're still playing out in our society. If our great-grandmothers were struggling to put food on the table, then imagine our grandmothers who had to change the narrative, how much harder they'd have to work, and how many of the odds were actually against them in that process. And with that, I think it's also important to tap into a concept that is super close to my heart, the concept of intersectionality, which is basically a sociological, analytical framework for understanding how groups and individuals basically experience unique combinations of discrimination. Back then, and even today, there's much inequality, much prejudice, much discrimination in being a Black person. But how much worse does it get when you are a Black woman? And what the concept of intersectionality makes you think about is, then how much worse would it be if you are a Black woman who's also queer? Now, when we look at all of those unique but heavy combinations of inequality, we can really begin to think about the amount of work we need to do. And that to truly uplift women, marginalized groups, we really have to have a grassroots approach to it. We need to start at the bottom. So with that, I bring you to the second part of this conversation, which is really just looking at research, using research to determine whether digital inclusion is something that we can make manifest and to basically measure our progress in that regard. Although I will say the first part of this conversation was led and was informed by the book that was edited by Trevor Ngwane and Mahloko Tsoedi, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, a sociological critique. I encourage you all to read it. It really puts into context how rapid change promotes further exclusion if it is not centered around inclusive development. But yeah, as for the second part of this conversation, we're also going to be looking at the book chapter that I authored or co-authored with my mentor, Mr. Mancha Johannes Sekololo. Such a wonderful mentor. Also really great in terms of cybersecurity and political thought in that regard. So with this book chapter, we're basically looking at whether the Fourth Industrial Revolution threatens the livelihoods of African women in the agricultural sector. And it's important to approach this conversation with a sense of knowing that African countries are not homogeneous. And there is still much work to do, right? For example, in Nigeria's digital agricultural strategy, we saw that women are actually vulnerable to unequal gender structures in the agricultural sector, right? And even though they're responsible for about 70% of agri-labor, they have access to less than 20% of agricultural resources. It simply becomes a food security issue, right? And that's where we see the magic of meeting people and meeting society where they are inclusive development, as I say. Because where, for example, as well, in Ethiopia, where there's little or no use of field phenotyping as a 4IR technology in agriculture, or inadequate technological capacity, or even limited funding to develop digital tools, that's where we see the value of inclusive development, the value of the UN Women Joint Program that injects basic labor skills such as basic line sewing to women smallholder farmers. And that's what inclusive development looks like. Inclusive development also looks like seeing where there are gaps, how we can develop them on a personal level, and where we integrate technology is where we've also given everyone a platform to navigate those technologies effectively, right? And then another example that I also use quite a lot to highlight the successes as well and the potential, the opportunity of science in African countries as well, is when I look at how, for example, around 65% of our land, our arable land in Africa is, it allows for, agriculture and, for crops to develop as well within these farms and within the livelihoods of women smallholder farmers, right? And when we look at, for example, Niger, women smallholder farmers there, they were able to secure a partnership that really changed things around for them. With small-scale drip irrigation as a method to reduce the burden of time in their labor practices, they eventually became more profitable as women smallholder farmers. They had more time to their families, but also didn't have to put too much labor as well, because the problem is climate change has also made our soils much more infertile as well. It affects our crop yield, it affects agriculture, and it hits marginalized communities, our farmers, our women, our communities. But there's hope. With these kinds of conversations, there'll always be hope. And today, my hope today is talking about G20 and how G20 could actually work to leverage some of these gaps and the gender digital divide that we see in our country and beyond, right? For example, I'm just thinking back on the fact that South Africa is hosting the G20. We have the G20 presidency. And with that, this gives us a unique opportunity to address the gender digital divide by leveraging on the leadership of G20 on the global stage, which means basically that we can really push for policies and initiatives that promote inclusive digital transformation. With the G20 presidency, we can expand initiatives such as She Codes and Tech for Women. We can allow for or create room for workforce transition programs. We could also develop gender-responsive finances. We can even get to the point of enhancing our broadband expansion so that underserved communities, but particularly those in rural areas, can be a part of this development, so that they can too experience technological and digital inclusion. And that's just something to think about, right? This could be a catalyst for local and global equity, because it will ultimately promote policies that empower women in the digital economy, whether that's giving our country and the people living in our country an opportunity to afford data and to expand in economic opportunities that are not necessarily physical. My heart always goes to informal workers who were painfully excluded during the COVID-19 pandemic. The informal workers that were told to stay at home even though they did not have access to data, Wi-Fi. To the learners who stayed in rural areas and really couldn't partake in their online lectures in a time of a global pandemic, right? And this is our chance to really, really speak on data governance in terms of AI, but also economic opportunities for all. And when we look at our country's legislation in terms of AI, it's also important to note that we do not have official legislation as a country on artificial intelligence. We do have South Africa's artificial intelligence framework, but it was drafted as policy formulation for discussion purposes. But it really, really speaks of the importance of setting positive goals for what South African society needs. It also addresses the challenge in Africans adopting AI, which is that a lot of the time it exacerbates current social and digital divides, right? And we need to ultimately adopt AI in a way that works best for us. We need to adopt it in a way that speaks to a lot of the gaps that we have. We can't be living in a country where so many people do not have access to internet and data, because the same people who cannot access those tools are simply cut out of economic opportunities. And for me, that translates to our society not being as productive as it can possibly be. And especially when you're looking at the book chapter that I co-authored with my mentor, it's important to also note that AI can assist with productivity, especially where climate change has caused a lot of environmental damage, specifically in the case of agriculture. This is also reaffirmed in the framework. And with that as well, the framework talks about the possibility for us to rethink education, right? To re-strengthen our focus on STEM subjects that are of high quality, finding ways to also make our literacy rates better. There's so many young people who do not know how to read. And whether it's developing some sort of artificial intelligence tools to assist with that, or even thinking twice about whether our education system needs to first cater to that, and then also including digital skills as part of the life orientation classes. I always think that would be great, to really make that across the board in all of our schools. There are some young people who want to participate in some of the programs we have at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And we have a lot of youth programs, events that really are centered on policy formulation, that are centered on really making young people raise their voices and acknowledge their constitutional rights and see diplomacy in action, right? But sometimes even those young people who are part of our network, they experience those digital divides. Some of them don't even know what Microsoft Word is. And we want to change that. We need to change that. Because for me, that translates to young people not being given an opportunity to develop to the best of their potential, right? And that's just what we can really, really look at, especially within the AI framework. I will say, just as a final closing note, I do think that our country does need to be more proactive and put a bit more urgency in terms of regulating and creating legislation on artificial intelligence, specifically because of the scale and magnitude of cybersecurity risks that we see in our country and beyond. I mean, when I think about Pegasus, an investigation that just shows how Israeli military spyware can literally penetrate through your phone, read through your text message, record you without your consent. That was a huge investigation that specifically targeted human rights defenders, journalists, people who were for the people and speaking on the inequalities that are experienced by vulnerable groups, but also pushed by people in power. But also Pegasus was also used to spy on government officials. And this was even a problem it was a problem of significance within European countries as well, specifically in the UK government, as well as in France too. And in our country as well, I'm sure to the people in South Africa listening, there's also been so many scams that come through your phone, and then you tap on a link and somehow your details are captured through phishing scams as well, right? Now more than ever is the time for us as a country to sit down and have a conversation about data governance, have a conversation about cybersecurity, but also making sure that everyone has access to data, to the internet, because how else can we say that we're fully productive? How else can we say that we are inclusive in our development as a country, right? So with that, I want to love and leave you all in terms of having bold conversations with real solutions. I really implore us all to just consider the lived realities of everyone around us, to consider the shortfalls, opportunities, victories and tribulations that we experience in this country, but also beyond. I encourage you all to leave knowing that politics is ingrained in everything that we do, and even the way in which we develop. It affects us as human beings because we are not able to develop in the same way. We are not able to work, live, and exist in a way that enriches all of our livelihoods. So with that as an end note, what I want to leave with you at the end of this discussion is that development should never have to leave anyone behind. I'm calling for inclusive development, specifically in this episode with digital inclusion. But I don't think that's the only topic I'm going to touch on in this podcast series. I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank you for having a bold conversation. I want to thank you for listening to some of my real solutions. Till next time, expect me to drop next week Sunday, where we're going to be talking about yet another topic. Thank you for joining me. Peace and love. I'm signing out. Bye.